time to sketch. So the supplies I have on hand over here are a piece of blank watercolor paper, a sketching pencil. Remember, mine is a 3H. If you don't have exactly a 3H, it's not a big deal. Just remember when you're sketching to be sketching as light as possible. So if you're using a mechanical pencil or you have a different lead, no worries. And I also have an eraser, actually 2 erasers on hand. So I have my click eraser right over here. And remember, this is for erasing very fine areas. And then I also have my kneaded eraser, which remember is for when we finish that sketch, pressing and lifting it off the page to lighten it. And a piece of scrap paper. So this is actually the backside of a little color study I did, little practice illustration. So I can use this to practice some thumbnail sketches. Later on, you can test out some paint colors on a scrap paper. It's just a handy thing to have on hand. Ooh, and pro tip, so this practice paper can also be used as a protective boundary between your palm and your paper as you paint. So remember, as you sketch or paint, it's really important not to have your skin touching the paper that much because the oils of your hand release onto the paper and it becomes a little tricky to fill in those areas when you're painting later on. So if you have a piece of scrap paper, you can really just use that to rest your palm as you sketch, if you want to be as extra as I am. So when it comes to repeat patterns that feel like a really nice, full, snug fit, I found that what works best is to have 3 different sizes of elements. So over here, I went ahead and painted the example before we painted, just to practice. So the 3 different sizes here are the one big hero element. So the hero element is just that. It's one big illustration that will take up most of the space on the pattern. Your medium elements, and in this case I have 2, can be arranged around your hero element when you're putting your pattern together. And all of the little detail elements can be fit into the gaps to help fill the space. So one big hero, a couple medium, and then a handful of little details that you can use to fill in the gaps of your seamless pattern. So the result will be this very cohesive, fleshed out design that is really easy to piece together. Trust me, that 3-size technique has made my pattern design life so much easier. So let's get into it. So I already have my example over here. I'm just gonna set it off to the side as a visual reference as we go. So let's go ahead and start with our hero element. Remember, this is the largest element that you'll be creating in your pattern. And real quick, remember when you're using your pencil, draw very lightly on your page. But for me, I'm actually going to be drawing pretty hard because I want you up on the camera to actually be able to see what I'm doing. So I'll be drawing very dark and heavy on my page, but as you follow along, keep it very light and airy. All right, so I'm going to start with that stem. So I'm simply going to draw it out like this. It's a very nice, slight curved line. So as you can see, I only drew one line to represent this stem over here, even though in my painting I have some thinner areas, some thicker areas. We don't need to sketch out every little detail like the width of the stem as we're sketching on our paper. In fact, it's better to keep as few pencil marks as possible on your page. So I don't draw every single little detail because I don't want a bunch of pencil marks muddying up my final watercolors. Instead, as few marks on the paper is better. This is why having some scrap paper might be helpful for you. You can sketch out your motif a few different times until you feel comfortable doing the final sketch on your actual paper. So if you want to practice a little bit on your scrap paper, that's completely fine. Once you're ready, you can go ahead and take those sketches and make it final on your watercolor paper. So I'm going to go back to my final paper and work on that hero element. So it looks like I have one primary stem and then maybe a stem coming off on one angle like this. And maybe I'll do the blooms. So we'll do 1, 2. So remember, this is way too dark, but I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. But as you follow along, very light and gentle sketches. All right, so I'll do the other bloom. And it doesn't have to be an incredibly realistic sketch. Mine is a very interpretive idea of what a flower arrangement might look like. So it's pretty heavy on the right side. I'm going to add a larger stem over here to help balance that out a little bit. Perfect. So my hero is completed. It's time to move on to those medium elements. So one thing to note is you'll notice that no part of my hero element is getting cropped off the page, and this is very intentional. You want to make sure that all of your elements are depicted in full. Nothing is getting cut off the page. Remember, you'll be cutting apart these elements and moving them all around your digital artboard, rotating, flipping, resizing, all that fun stuff. So a full, uncropped element is going to work a lot better than something that gets abruptly cut off the page. So even though these flower stems, theoretically, continue down into the ground and turn into roots, I don't necessarily need to show all of those details. Instead, I'll just taper those edges in a way that looks very pleasing and is going to be great when I arrange it into a seamless pattern later on. So if you're following along and you're choosing a different motif, maybe it's a cherry blossom branch, you don't need to show that branch necessarily extending onto the tree trunk, the roots, the leaves, all of that. You can just find a way to selectively taper the edge of that branch so that it looks nice and natural. For me, I usually round my edges or I taper them into a fine point. We'll get more into this as we're painting. And something I want to point out real quick. I don't care too much about messing up my sketch on this paper. I'm painting all of these elements specifically so that I can rearrange them later on into a repeat pattern in Photoshop. So this original artwork is probably never going to be hung on a wall or presented in a gallery. It's simply one part of a longer process. So because of that, this paper is not precious to me. If I mess up one of my flowers, I'll simply paint another one right next to it and then not use that first one. I'm only going to be using the good stuff later on when it comes to pulling these elements together into a pattern. I might even test out my paint pans on the same paper as well, just to see what's working best. This is why I like working on large paper like this, because it gives me a little bit more room to explore and play, see what's working, see what's not working. Plus, I don't have to feel stressed about making it absolutely perfect. If it doesn't work, just paint right next to it. If I drop a big blob of water on my paper, no worries, that will never show up in the final pattern because I'll just remove it in Photoshop. So maybe it takes you a few tries before you paint that perfect flower or moose or banana or whatever motif you're following along with. That's completely fine. You're going to use the best ones later on in your pattern in Photoshop. The duds are just going to sink into oblivion. So just keep this in mind as you go. This paper is for exploration and play. We'll keep the good stuff, toss the bad stuff, no worries. All right, next up, it is time for the medium elements. I usually do between 1 and 3 medium elements. Today I'm going to stick with 2, a front-facing bloom, and then a head-on shot of the flower. So just to make things a little bit easier, I'm going to use my water dish, trace around it, so that I can get a good estimation of this flower. Perfect. All right, a center area, and then a few blooms. Perfect, and now for the final medium element is this front-facing flower. So again, pretty simple. A nice little curvy stem, some leaves coming out, and then that top bloom. And finally, it's time for the detail elements. So remember, these are the little guys you'll be using later on to fill the gaps of your pattern. And I want to keep my overall floral theme really strong and consistent, so my detail elements are going to be pulled from the exact same motifs that I just painted. So instead of a full flower, it'll be a few individual petals and some leaves. I'm also going to include a few small budding flowers and dots. Dots are always really good when you're trying to fill in very small gaps. Dots will be your best friends. So this is going to give me a really nice variety to use later on. Plus, the details are going to be all similar shapes and colors to the hero in medium, which is going to help my pattern feel a lot more cohesive. All right, so let's go ahead and draw in some of these detail elements. I'll start with these budding flowers over here. So curvy line, same as before. I'll just do one leaf, a stem coming out this way. Maybe this one is just a bud, and this one can be a full bloom. And then I'll do another one over here. This one can just be two buds and one big leaf. And then the individual petals, which are very, very simplified shapes. And a couple leaves. And I'll do one full flower from the side. And for the dots, I don't actually have to draw those. I know how to paint a circle, so I'm just going to put a little star here to remind me to do those dots. And that is it. So your sketch should look very simple, as few lines as possible, and very light pencil marks. And remember, if you want to go ahead and lighten up your marks even further so that you can just barely see them as you paint, you can use your eraser and just very, very gently erase on your page like this until it's very, very faint and you can barely see it. Or if you have a kneaded eraser like this, you can simply use that kneaded eraser, press it on your paper, and pull it up to lighten that sketch even further. But remember, I'm going to skip that step because I want you guys to be able to see my sketch very clearly on the camera. So pro tip, like I was mentioning earlier with collecting footage as you go to use for social media posts, because they look really good, this would be a really great place to start. So if you want to put together a reel or an Instagram post showing the process, go ahead and snap a few photos of what your sketch looks like, or maybe do a nice panning video across your sketch. And you can use that later when you're showing the behind the scenes process for how you created this beautiful pattern. All right, so once you feel like you're at a pretty great place with your sketch, it's time for the very fun part, which is getting out your paints, colored pencils, markers, whatever you're following along with, and we're gonna start filling in our shapes with color.